notice flip-flops in communication like this. At best, it makes them wonder about the lasting veracity of public health messages. At worst, it makes them deeply suspicious. Over the course of the summer of 2020, while the clinical trials were ongoing, outside scientists still had no access to what exactly was being measured and hence studied, so there was no external check on or observation of the process, despite much of the research having been funded by government. Marketing and distribution would be done by the government. The government would be providing the customers, and the government would even pay for the consequences of safety problems that might arise. Withholding protocols, rather than disseminating them as widely as possible, was, under such circumstances, a sign of outlandish chutzpah. And the governmental agencies that are supposed to advocate for the public, in this case the FDA, CDC, and NIH, countenanced it. In September 2020, one bit of secrecy was lifted. It turned out that AstraZeneca had stopped its clinical trial twice. The first pause was not even announced. The second one was, but neither the UK public, nor the FDA, nor scientists were immediately told why. Before they ever found out, however, AstraZeneca CEO Pasquale Soriot did privately disclose the reason, 2 cases of serious neurological damage, to the J.P. Morgan Investment Bank. To some, this said much about who exactly this process was designed to benefit. Quote, "The communication has been horrible and unacceptable," close quote, vaccine advocate and virologist Peter Hotez said. Quote, "This is not how the American people should be hearing about this," close quote. Scientists started to demand to see the protocols. Hotez and others, quote, criticized obtuse statements released by government officials, including UK regulators, who he said failed to supply a rationale for resuming their trials, close quote. Government officials and the regulators, who most citizens assume are there to keep the process honest, seemed instead to be partners in the obfuscation. In November 2020, the exciting news arrived. We had vaccine liftoff. Phase 3 trials of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were said to be 95% and 94.5% efficacious, as Fauci and the company press releases announced, and the emergency use authorization was granted on the basis of these 2-month studies, allowing distribution of the vaccines to millions. Efficacious is the term used to describe how effective a treatment is in the artificial situation of a clinical trial with volunteer patients, a group not always representative of the wider population. Effective is the term used to describe how a treatment works in the real world. The media quickly assumed the two were the same. To them, hearing that a vaccine was 95% efficacious meant it was practically perfect, which the press repeated over and over. But what exactly were the vaccines efficacious at doing? Stopping viral transmission? Preventing severe illness or reducing hospitalization or ICU admissions? Preventing death? Efficacious for how long? And efficacious in whom? In the elderly who are most vulnerable to death? Without clear definitions and answers to these questions, typical of much of the coverage, Americans only had a limited idea, really, of what these vaccines had been shown to do in the narrow universe of clinical trials, let alone what they do when given to the public. In fact, they didn't receive answers to a single one of these questions. Moreover, there was still a cloud of mystery surrounding the trials. After pressure mounted in the wake of the AstraZeneca revelation in September, the 4 major Western vaccine manufacturers finally released their protocols, each over 100 pages long. After the protocols were released, Peter Doshi, an associate editor at the British Medical Journal, who does research into drug approval processes and how results are communicated to the public, tried to sound an alarm. Quote, "None of the trials currently underway are designed to detect a reduction in any serious outcome, such as hospital admissions, use of intensive care, or deaths," close quote, he said. Only one of the studies, of the Oxford AstraZeneca, looked at whether vaccinated individuals were less likely to transmit virus by doing weekly PCR swabbing. Vaccinated people had lower viral loads, were less likely to have a positive COVID test, and were positive for shorter durations. Very good news indeed, though not automatically applicable to the other mRNA vaccine studies. So, what were these clinical trial studies that showed 95% and 94.5% efficacy looking at, if not saving lives and viral transmission? Consider that researchers can set up a study to examine whether a vaccine prevents a person from experiencing any or all of the following events, sometimes called endpoints. An asymptomatic infection. The patient is carrying the virus, but the case is so mild that they don't know it, even though it is shown to be present by a positive virus test. A clinically symptomatic infection that is mild and might be confused with a common cold. A clinically symptomatic infection that is moderate. A clinically symptomatic infection that requires hospital admission. A clinically symptomatic severe infection requiring ICU admission and even a ventilator. A clinically symptomatic severe infection that ends in death. What were the events or the endpoints that the Phase 3 Moderna and Pfizer studies claimed to be examining? They said they looked at any clinically significant infection, quote, of essentially any severity as the primary endpoint. But therein lies the rub. As Doshi explained, quote, "Severe illness requiring hospital admission, which happens in only a small fraction of symptomatic COVID-19 cases, would be unlikely to occur in significant numbers in trials. Because most people with symptomatic COVID-19 experience only mild symptoms, even trials involving 30,000 or more patients would turn up relatively few cases of severe disease." Close quote. How few serious cases in terms of deaths were there? In the Pfizer trial, not a single person died of COVID-19.